The man who was responsible for the policies that led to the war was Lord North, seen here in the robes of the Chancellor of the University of Oxford. I've often said it should be the sister university of UVA. They both have undergraduates who boast that they're the homes of lost causes. And they both claim to be the home of the Cavaliers. Oxford really was the headquarters of British royalists during the English Civil War. Lord North was responsible for the Tea Act and was responsible for what in Britain are called the Coercive Acts in the spring of 1774 and what in America are called the Intolerable Acts. Ironically, he'd helped to diffuse the situation in America for about 3 years, to the extent that Britain was more worried about a war with Spain than a war in America. But nevertheless, in reaction to the Boston Tea Party, the Coercive Acts essentially act as the catalyst for the war. What interested me, though, about Lord North was that as soon as he realized that the problem went beyond Massachusetts, and he realized that in about December of 1774, when he read the resolutions of the Continental Congress and realized that there really was unity between the 13 colonies, he immediately started to backpedal, and he continued to try to backpedal for the rest of the war. Lord North went to great lengths to engage in some forms of negotiation. His first act was to offer what's known as his conciliatory bill at the beginning of 1775, which would have allowed the colonies to tax themselves. He made his best offer in 1778, what's known as the Carlisle Peace Commission, in which essentially he was holding out merely a token British leadership and the promise that Britain would never tax the colonies, a promise, incidentally, which it largely kept in the British West Indies and in much of the rest of the empire, other than in trade taxes, but not direct taxes. And he tried all forms of negotiation secretly, often in opposition to his own ministers and to the king. And this is a man who's all too often regarded as a rubber stamp, as someone who merely enacted the wishes of the king, and yet he went out on a limb to try to negotiate. To this day, it's popular to speak in Parliament of someone being the worst Prime Minister since Lord North. So he's gone down in history as Britain's worst Prime Minister. It was very popular, especially during the Macmillan years, to use this phrase, which is very unfair, because essentially he's only known as being a bad minister because of Britain's loss of America. In fact, he was one of the great parliamentarians in the 18th century, one of the only prime ministers who managed to survive a war for as long as he did. Remember Sir Robert Walpole, who is often regarded as Britain's first prime minister and is the prime minister against whom North is compared disfavourably. Walpole fell from office at the beginning of a war with Spain. Most prime ministers didn't survive. He was one of the great oratarians in Parliament, one of the greatest speakers. He would come into Parliament at noon, just as sessions were warming up, and he would stay often to the early hours of the morning. He'd wait till late at night and then give a 2-hour speech without a single note. Now, we today admire British Prime Ministers for doing a 1-hour question time once a week in Parliament. Lord North was doing this for 3 days a week. Furthermore, he held essentially 2 modern positions. He was not only the Prime Minister, but he fulfilled the role of a modern Chancellor of the Exchequer, or here what we call the Secretary of the Treasury. He was the one responsible for negotiating the budget, which he did personally. And it's well worth keeping in mind that Britain remained solvent during the American Revolution. Despite the fact that the national debt was the greatest fear, every prime minister essentially in the 18th century was chosen for their financial acumen and their ability to work with the debt, because this was the great domestic concern. It was one of the main reasons why Britain originally taxed America. France, on the other hand, went bankrupt as a result of its involvement in the American Revolution. North negotiated all those loans. One of the reasons he was so anxious that the war not continue, he was so anxious to have a negotiated compromise, is that he believed it would in fact bankrupt